Hello, you video game loving people. I am Waifu Belector, the only fair human on Earth, and I'm here to share some of my fair opinions about the still pretty recently released Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I'll also likely touch on some opinions and facts regarding the wider franchise as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. So to start, basically we're getting some insider reports that FF7 Rebirth isn't selling so hot, at least in comparison to its predecessor, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and even compared to Final Fantasy XVI. And Final Fantasy XVI pretty famously sold just okay, but apparently Rebirth is currently below even that, when compared to where 16 was at this point in its life cycle. So exactly how far off are Rebirth sales compared to other recent Final Fantasy games? Well, it's been about a month and a half since Rebirth released, and the game is said to have sold around 2 million units. So 2 million units in around 6 weeks. For comparison, the first game, Final Fantasy VII Remake, in 3 days, not weeks, days, that game sold 3 million copies and allegedly reached 4 million around its 6th week out. So the new game Rebirth is currently on pace to only sell about half of what its predecessor sold. So clearly that's not great, but also not quite as bad as it might seem. I'll get into all the possible whys and hows in a second, but first let's finish laying out all of our numbers, because there is another more recent Final Fantasy to compare Rebirth to, Final Fantasy XVI, which sold 3 million units in its first week. Again, we put that against Rebirth's 2 million in 6 weeks, and things aren't looking so hot for Rebirth. So why exactly is this happening, and how did we get here? Assuming these sales figures are true, of course. I'll start with the most obvious piece and the biggest conversation surrounding this: exclusivity. All 3 of the games I have talked about in this video were exclusive to PlayStation consoles. And so the question becomes, is exclusivity harmful to game sales? And the answer is harmful to game sales? Yes, 100% being exclusive means less sales. But does it mean less profits? Not necessarily. That is a case-by-case basis. It costs money to make additional ports of games. Making an Xbox version isn't as simple as changing cross to A and circle to B. And the amount of people who may want to play your game on Xbox may not be enough to justify the cost of making that port. Also, often when these exclusivity deals are struck up, the party paying for exclusivity also pumps additional funds into the project. They then also have an incentive to advertise and market it as well. And that may be crucial advertising and marketing you wouldn't get without being exclusive. So the pros and cons of exclusivity are very much a case-by-case thing to be looked at. And in the case of the Final Fantasy franchise, seeing as how their last 3 major offerings were PlayStation exclusive, I certainly do think that it's possible that exclusivity is hurting them. I think Sony and PlayStation are no doubt benefiting from this partnership just fine, but there could be a world where Square Enix is coming up short. However, that is only a possibility, but I'd believe it if some more evidence flew my way. I mean, plus Square Enix is always bitching about games not meeting sales expectations, so the answer to mitigating that, at least with Final Fantasy, might be to end the PlayStation exclusivity. And I think that is what they want to do, but the deal for timed exclusivity on the entire 7 Remake trilogy was signed a long time ago. So if the exclusivity ends, it won't be with the 3rd installment. But okay, we've jotted down the possibility of exclusivity being damaging to the sales of 7 Rebirth, but what else? Well, clearly one reason Rebirth sold less than Remake is because Remake was on PS4 and Rebirth is on PS5. And although the PS5 is currently outpacing where the PS4 was at this point in its life cycle, in totality, the late PS4 had a substantially larger install base than the middle-aged PS5. Simply put, there were just more people who could get Remake as opposed to the amount of people that can get Rebirth. However, while that may explain why Rebirth is selling so much less than Remake, it doesn't explain why Rebirth is lagging behind Final Fantasy XVI, which also only released on PS5. And so to explain this part, I feel I have to conjure up my own theories based on personal analysis. So here I go. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a hard nostalgia title, but it also undoubtedly brought in some people who had never played the original or maybe any Final Fantasy like myself. Thing is though, while I do believe 7 Remake is a really good game, it does have a fair amount of obvious shortcomings that I think disappointed others a lot more than myself, so much so that they didn't come back for more. You then, right after Remake, release a game that polarizes the entire fanbase by completely doing away with the RPG genre altogether with Final Fantasy XVI. Not to mention, these games are just nowhere near as amazing as they looked before release. I can confirm feeling kind of burned by both 7 Remake and 16 after I played them, because they were nowhere near as good as I thought they'd be. And of course, that's my bad, but what can I say? Final Fantasy marketing is really good. And I don't think I was the only one who was kinda duped and let down. In fact, I think other people were let down significantly more than me. However, I think after experiencing the reality of those games, more so 7 Remake because it directly relates to Rebirth, a lot of the non-nostalgia fans didn't care to come back because they figured it'd be more of what Remake offered. How could they know that this time, the game with the amazing exciting trailers is actually going to be an amazing game? They'd already been kind of tricked once. I mean, in my review of Rebirth, I spoke about how I want to recommend it to everyone, but I can't because I think they should play Remake first, and Remake is just a greatly inferior game. Listen, I've done all that talking there to say that I think the first game put people off of the second one. Not because Remake is bad, but it misses a lot of key RPG elements that I think people were expecting. Remake is super linear, super restrictive, and it lacks any sense of player expression and a real freedom of choice. All of that doesn't make for a bad game, but it does make for a mildly disappointing RPG. Plus, again, the follow-up, 16, also wasn't an RPG and had its own problems, like having what may be the worst side quests ever in a game. It doesn't inspire confidence that the new RPG will be outstanding, even though it is. Honestly, more so than anything, I think this is a Final Fantasy problem, more than it is an exclusivity issue. I think for quite a while now, they've had a really dated sense of RPG making, but Final Fantasy VII Rebirth really gives me a ton of hope that Square Enix themselves know that and are moving toward being better, because this is the first game since maybe Final Fantasy XII probably that hasn't felt decently behind the times in some way. And that's a beautiful thing, man. So is exclusivity hurting Rebirth and Final Fantasy? Sure, likely enough. But just as much, I think Final Fantasy has damaged itself. Fortunately, not in any way that can't be recovered from, in my opinion. They're still very popular, and with a couple of design philosophy tweaks and a couple of undeniable bangers, the franchise can be bigger than it's ever been. And that's what I'm hoping for. Anyway, I just thought the lackluster sales of such a fantastic game was an interesting topic. What do you all think though? Hop in the comments and tell me how stupid and wrong I am. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like. Maybe you can even subscribe for more videos in the future. Regardless though, until next time, I am Waifu Belector. I am just a normal guy. I like hentai, and I love Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Goodbye.